Hi, welcome to week 5. Quick overview of our materials and what we're going to be looking at. So here's what we're going to be looking at. Alright, so let's start with the first thing. Picture letters from the Commander-in-Chief of Iwo Jima. So this book, it's not prose, it's not a graphic novel, it's literally what it says. It's picture letters. So our commander, before he's in charge of Iwo Jima, he was sent to the United States. He spent a few years in the U.S., and while he was here doing all the dog and pony show and jumping through all the hoops that he was asked to do as a representative of Japan, he had a very young boy. He had a whole family, but these are mostly letters sent to his young boy, who was too young to read. And he felt really bad about being away from his young son and his family in general. So he would write these letters home, and each letter, because his son was too young to read, each letter would have a picture kind of describing what's going on, so his young son could see that, and then his wife was supposed to read off what was going on. So then the idea is he felt like he still had a relationship with his son. Pretty sweet. For those of you who are like me and prefer to read things in English, after each picture letter is an English translation. So, just a little warning, if you were to read this in your classes, it's a bit choppy because they're individual letters sent, and sometimes there's some letters missing and different things happen. So there's that. There's also a little bit of fat shaming and a little bit of sexism and some things like that. But it does give you an interesting look into the mind of a Japanese citizen in America at this time. The part we'll be looking at is near the end. These are mostly communiques to his higher ups, as well as some to his wife, so obviously no pictures there. Somehow I doubt that his commanders would have wanted picture letters. So there you go. If you're not familiar with Iwo Jima, here's your real quick overview. Iwo Jima, it's a small island, very small island, near Japan. It had Japanese soldiers stationed there. Its big feature, iconic feature, I guess, if you will, besides the black sand, is it's got one mountain on it. Part of the reason that Americans went after this island is, A, its location, and B, the fact that it had 3 airfields on it. A lot of the flying fortresses that would go into Japan, bomb Japan, on their way back, if they had any problems or anything like that, they had no place to emergency land. Going all the way back to Tinian, if anything happened, you would tank into the ocean and you might not be found. And if you are, it could be days. That's assuming you survive the crash landing. So having 3 airfields very close to Japan, that did have a nice emergency landing option. But so the taking of the island, for weeks before the U.S. landed any soldiers there was a campaign of bombing and shelling, more or less destroying every ounce of beauty on the island. A lot of the soldiers who recount their battle there just talk about how it was like stepping foot in hell. It was hot. There was no cover. You couldn't dig. There was no soil. You just had this hot black sand everywhere. Just not a good place to be. Whether you're an American or a Japanese soldier, the chances that you made it off the island without being killed or wounded were very, very, very small. We're talking 10, 15% chance in some of the cases, even less. So, not a great place to be. And then if you add the mental issues on top of that, today Iwo Jima is really hard to get to. It's more or less a closed island. I believe there's a Japanese military base there. And then one day a year, it's opened up to veterans and their families from both sides, Japanese and Americans, to come and try and create bonds and encourage peace. Part of the reason it's closed off is at least from what I've been told and the way it's been explained to me, is no matter where you step on the island, you could very, very well be stepping on dead bodies. Bodies weren't necessarily collected and put into nice graves or even mass graves. They're all over the island. So the whole island is seen as a tomb. So while that battle was supposed to take a few days, it ended up taking much, much longer. Speaking of taking much, much longer, we've got Hiro Onoda's writing. Hiro Onoda is famous for his book here. It's called My 30 Years War. No Surrender, My 30 Years War. This lieutenant, second lieutenant, was a little bit different than what we normally think of for Japanese soldiers. Near the end of World War II, there were some soldiers who were being sent to a slightly different training program. Lieutenant Onoda is kind of taught about propaganda and guerrilla fighting and different ways of waging war. He's then stationed on the Philippines, and even when World War II ends, he doesn't know it ends. He keeps on fighting for decades after World War II ends. In fact, when he surrenders not because he gives up. It was because his old commander was brought in and ordered him to surrender. So he returns to Japan. He's considered a hero despite having surrendered, although by then it's the 1970s, so a little different than if he had surrendered in 1940s. So he was not the only one on the island, but by the time he surrenders, he's the only one left. His fellow soldiers were either killed or surrendered before him. So the book, this is the only book with selections that you're getting that aren't actually PDF files of the book. What you're getting is some different parts that I've used in my classes before. I've extracted some different quotes and some different pieces. While this book does have a lot of really interesting parts to it, it's not a book that I would necessarily recommend going cover to cover with your students. He does get pretty meticulous in a lot of things that, unless your student is maybe a survival expert, might not find terribly interesting. And then the Philippines, just really quick. The U.S. gets it from Spain. It's property of the United States. When we got Pearl Harbor happening, the Japanese march in. They take the Philippines. We have the largest surrendering of American soldiers. We get the commander of the soldiers is told that he needs to sneak out in the middle of the night. He's ordered to leave all his troops behind. The troops that surrendered, they were sent on the Bataan Death March. And what that was is that was a multi-day march across the island. The American soldiers were forced to march without any food or drink, little to no rest, and then a lot of really horrible things happened to the soldiers, being beaten to death, run over. There are tales of, at night, Japanese soldiers driving by in cars with the lights off, with swords out the window, decapitating people who were just walking. Lots of horrible things. A lot of the soldiers did not make the march. Multiple days without water, but today the Philippines is the Philippines. All right, the poems you're gonna be looking at, you got a wide variety, really. There aren't a lot of poems, but I tried to space out the different types. You've got one from a commander of kamikaze troops, and then one from a kamikaze soldier. I think that's an interesting mix right there. And then one from our commander from Iwo Jima, his death poem. Now, death poems, if you're not familiar with them, more or less supposed to be pretty stoic, and as the name states, you write this right around the time of your death. A lot of high-ranking soldiers who wrote death poems expected them to be printed in the newspaper, and so not only would their families see them, but just about all of Japan would be able to see it. So that's interesting, I think. We'll look at that. I really find his death poem to be quite interesting, especially some of the little parts that he put in there. As far as kamikaze, if you're not terribly familiar, the idea comes from actually the Mongolian invasion of Japan long time ago. It means divine wind. From a practical standpoint, this idea of if one plane can take out a boat, it's that's a pretty good expense for the cost if you're just looking at like the price of one plane with one bomb versus one American boat. I think just about everybody's familiar with kamikaze, so I'm not going to go too much in the details of that. All right, so optional stuff. You've got Nanking. The author of this book, his parents came to the United States. He was born in the U.S. himself, but his parents come from China. Long history of animosity towards Japan from China, and a lot of it stems from things like the Nanking Massacre during World War II. So this book, I would say the whole book is not necessarily school appropriate because there will be some horrible things that happened in the Nanking Massacre. I mean, there's rape, there's killing, there's killing of babies, there's lots of bad stuff that happens. One thing I do like, Ethan Young, the author of this book, he doesn't get gratuitous with the stuff in there. In fact, he leaves a lot of it kind of in the background or more mentioned than actually being shown. But there are large chunks of this that are very useful. So this book, kind of a different artistic style than a lot of the ones we're looking at. It is a graphic novel. Your selection, it's going to be pretty early in the book for the most part. A couple of Chinese soldiers who are trying to get to the safety zone. During the Nanking Massacre, there were different people. You've got, I believe it was a German priest, and you've got doctors and people from different countries setting up safe zones to bring in Chinese women, Chinese children, Chinese anybody, and trying to protect them from the Japanese soldiers. So these two Chinese soldiers are trying to make it to one of these safe areas. So the Nanking Massacre, definitely a horrible thing. There are some people who adamantly say it did not happen. It's a lot of times called the forgotten Holocaust or the hidden Holocaust. I would caution you though if you're going to have students look it up because there are a lot of very disturbing pictures and videos online. Alright, Voices of the Pacific. Like I said, this is not by an Asian author. But what's interesting about this, so the soldiers from Voices of the Pacific, these are soldiers, American soldiers, fighting in the Pacific Ocean. Well, not in the ocean, sorry. The selection you're going to be looking at is from them fighting on New Britain. So what you're going to see is some of the accounts are similar to what Mizuki writes about in his book, and some are going to be very, very different. So I thought, if you want to, it could be interesting to read that account having just finished Onwards Towards Our Noble Death. All right, New Britain, got a little map of it right here. I don't think you need to know a whole lot about it because you just read a whole book about it. But what is interesting about New Britain that I want to add real quick, both Mizuki's account here and from Voice of the Pacific tend to leave off the natives in their accounts. Mizuki will write a different series later, the Showa series, and in that he will actually include a large chunk of it about the natives. But in these two accounts, they're left off. Alright, that's sorry it wasn't as quick as usual, but a lot of different materials to preview. Any questions, as always, just ask.